Welcome to Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we'll walk you through the Epicurean texts and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. We're now in the middle of a series of podcasts intended to provide a general overview of Epicurean philosophy based on the organizational structure employed by Norman DeWitt in his book, Epicurus and His Philosophy. Now let's join the discussion. Welcome to episode 189. We are today going to finish Epicurus and His Philosophy. We are in the fourth episode of discussing chapter 15, entitled Extensions, Submergence, and Revival. And today we're on the happier title that closes the book, The Epicurean Revival. DeWitt says that the renaissance of Epicurean studies was delayed until the 17th century and was at first confined to France. And strange to say, it was begun by a man in holy orders, Pierre Gassendi, who was attracted both by the ethical and the physical doctrines of Epicurus. The ethics presented little difficulty. The difference was not so much in content as in the absence and presence of divine sanction. The difficulty was greater in the case of physics, but Gassendi solved it neatly by declaring it was God who had created the atoms. And this combination of Christian and Epicurean doctrine was taken over by Sir Isaac Newton and made more acceptable to religious people through that technique. Before we started the episode today, we had a brief conversation about several other people of note. Gassendi is not the first person we have record of who was explicitly saying good things about Epicurus as the Dark Ages were coming to a close. One of the first that we identified was Lorenzo Valla, whose work on pleasure or of the true and the false good in 1431 takes a very Epicurean position as to the role of pleasure and implicit criticism of the Stoics. It's been a while since I've reviewed that. There's a lot of good material in it. I think the consensus is that Lorenzo Valla does not explicitly end up endorsing Epicurus because, of course, that would have contradicted the restrictions of religion at the time. But the arguments that Valla places in the Epicureans are more persuasive than those which he gives to the Stoics. So that there's a lot of Epicurean sympathetic material here in Lorenzo Valla.
Right. So Lorenzo Valla and Poggio Bracciolini, who was the discoverer of the manuscript of Lucretius in 1417, have a lot in common when it comes to their careers, and in particular that they both worked as apostolic scriptors in the papal curia. This is the sort of political court of the Vatican. And of course, neither of these guys, Lorenzo Valla or Poggio, were themselves in holy orders. So they were involved in the day-to-day maintenance of this massive bureaucracy in the Vatican, keeping track of letters, translating documents into and out of Latin, casting the popes, what he dictates to them, into a high Latin register, and so forth. And in that role, I know Poggio became apostolic secretary to a pope, and I'm not sure if Lorenzo Valla did. But it was actually Lorenzo Valla who discovered, using Latin etymology, that the donation of Constantine was a forgery. And luckily, he had the kind of pope who was interested in that stuff and didn't immediately have him executed for that. So it's here, of all places, in the Vatican, where this early interest in Epicureanism sort of revives itself, both with Poggio and with Lorenzo Valla.
Copies of his True and False Good are available on the internet. And here's something from the introduction to that. It says, when Valla first wrote this treatise in 1431, he called it On Pleasure, and it was only in a later version that it became known as Of the True and the False Good. It seeks to debate the question of how humanity can achieve the good by following the precepts of ancient philosophical schools, notably Epicureanism and Stoicism, or by accepting the guidance of Christian teachings. The matter is debated by a number of eminent orators, poets, and clerics, and at the end it is agreed that Christianity provides the best way of achieving the good life. In choosing to prefer the arguments of the Epicureans over those of the Stoics, however, he was being deliberately provocative. The ideas of the Stoics, who advocated virtue for its own sake, were clearly more compatible with conventional Christian teachings than those of the former, who argue in favor of pleasure as the guiding principle of moral behavior. And so the point there is that Valla gives the better side of the argument to the Epicureans, which is counterintuitive since the Stoic argument is more compatible with that of the Christians. So there's good material in Lorenzo Valla's On Pleasure.
Something that ties into that is someone that you mentioned, and I didn't know of, Cassius, who predated Valla by 2 years in publishing. This is Cosmo Raimondi, who apparently was from Lombardy, but very little is known about his life in contrast to some of these other figures. He calls himself a native of Cremona. He was the pupil of a well-known humanist teacher, Barzizza, probably at Milan. And his only significant work is the epistolary treatise in defense of Epicurus, translated here. Its importance lies in the fact that it is the only thoroughgoing espousal of Epicurean ethical doctrine of the Quattrocento, preceding not only the widespread dissemination of the ancient sources on Epicureanism, Book 10 of Diogenes Laertius and De Rerum Natura of Lucretius, but also the popular dialogue of Lorenzo Valla on pleasure. Raimondi argues for a human good, one which takes account of the whole parcel of body and mind, which we are, and he finds it in the pleasure of Epicurus, a pleasure not opposed to virtue, but both guided and produced by it. That is from a précis of a book published by Cambridge University Press, edited by Jill Cray. The word Quattrocento is the 15th century as a period of Italian art or architecture. So it's kind of like when we talk about the British Romantic period or the Enlightenment. That's the Quattrocento in Italy in the 15th century.
And Joshua, there was a translation of Raimondi's letter by Martin Davies, which is excellent. I recommend that to everyone to read that. It is just, as you described it, it is an endorsement of Epicurean ethics, of pleasure being the greatest good. It is a criticism of the academics, of the Stoics and the Aristotelians. It is a full-throated defense of Epicurus's positions, apparently in the form of a letter to a friend of his who had previously been Epicurean, but who had sort of defected over to the Stoic camp. And here's a part of it from near the end of the letter. Cosmo Raimondi says, quote, "You must at length give up your attacks on Epicurus then. Reform yourself and return to the camp in which you once fought with distinction. You have now turned against him under the spell of Stoic subtlety of argument, and seduced by the majesty and the splendor of the academics and peripatetics. But you may be forgiven for that, since you are a younger man, not yet of age to form a proper judgment on these very difficult matters with the indulgence granted to youth. But now that you've been fully instructed in the arguments of Epicurus, if you persevere in your hostility towards him, you will be thought intolerably arrogant and not a little stupid." This is near the end of the letter, having stated these arguments of Epicurus. So this is a document that is just filled with very good information and arguments that we can learn from ourselves.
Right. And what it represents is an attempt to pull Epicureanism out of the mire in which it had been buried for millennia. And these guys really do deserve credit for their effort. So both of those, Lorenzo Valla and Cosmo Raimondi, wrote after the rediscovery of Lucretius. But in the 13th century, we're going backwards here, there was an Italian aristocrat in Florence named Farinata degli Uberti. And his main claim to fame is that he is in hell in Dante's Inferno, of course, in that sixth circle of hell, the circle of heresy. And the heresy of which he was guilty was the heresy that all Epicureans are guilty of, and that is the heresy of denying the immortality of the soul. And Boccaccio, who is, interestingly enough, wrote very critically of Leontian, has this to say. He says, he, Farinata, was of the opinion of Epicurus that the soul dies with the body, and maintained that human happiness consists in temporal pleasures. He did not follow these, though, in the way that Epicurus did, that is, by making long fasts, to have afterwards pleasure in eating dry bread, but was fond of good and delicate viands, and ate them without waiting to be hungry, and for this sin he is damned as a heretic in this place. So even before the rediscovery of Lucretius, or as that other source said, the widespread publication of Diogenes Laertius, there are earlier sources that are picking up on some of this stuff. And Farinata is an interesting example of that.
Before we eventually move forward to Gassendi, Joshua, is there anybody else we want to mention? I know that you brought up the name Michael Morellus, who wrote some poetry and apparently, the story goes, died in the middle of a stream with a copy of De Rerum Natura on his body.
Yep. So on the 10th of April, 1500, this is Wikipedia talking, after visiting with the humanist Raffaello Maffei in Volterra, he was riding in full armor to join the armed forces against Caesar Borgia. This is the guy that Machiavelli thought should be pope because of his ruthlessness, Caesar Borgia. So Michael Morellus was riding against him when he drowned with his horse in the river Cecina near Volterra. And what they found in his pocket was a copy of On the Nature of Things. So that's the year 1500. So one of the things that tells us is that Lucretius's poem, which was rediscovered in 1417, has now been sufficiently circulated to where you have editions of the poem that can just about, I guess, fit in a pocket. Now, I don't know what's being described there, but there was a Renaissance printer named Aldus Manutius who founded what was called the Aldine Press. And he was born circa 1449, died circa 1515. His goal was to, as he said, inundate the reader in Greek and Latin literature. And to that end, he had several new typefaces created, typefaces that were in Greek. No one had ever printed in Greek prior to this man. What they used to do when they printed a book with Greek in it is they would print the Latin script, and then someone who could write Greek would come in later and write the Greek for each copy in the space provided. So he's actually printing in Greek. So this is hugely important. But the other thing he did was he created what he called the Enchiridia, which was a small portable book which revolutionized personal reading. And those Enchiridia are the predecessor of the modern paperback. And we know that one of the books that he published was Lucretius. I don't know. I don't know if this is the book that was found on Morellus's person when he drowned, but as the forerunner to the modern sort of pocket edition paperback, we can assume it might well have been. I don't know. But in any case, according to Stephen Greenblatt in his book, he becomes a kind of cautionary figure. You know, if you dabble in this stuff, it will lead you to your death. Because what you're really toying with here is satanic influence.
Okay, well, stop me if anyone else comes to mind as we move back to Gassendi. But Gassendi is a particularly important figure for several reasons as we proceed. He is not only recognized as one of the leading figures in the repopularization of Epicurus, but I think an argument can be made that Gassendi's Life of Epicurus is perhaps one of the very earliest English language editions of a work on Epicurus. From Wikipedia, it says in 1645, Gassendi was a chair of mathematics at the Royal College in Paris. So we're talking about the mid-1600s at this point. The version that became eventually accessible to the English-speaking world was Volume 3 of Thomas Stanley's 1660 History of Philosophy. And there are PDF editions of that out there on archive.org, which we'll link in today's show notes as well. But this is an extensive, almost a rewrite with additional commentary of what Diogenes Laertius had written, not only about the life, but also about the doctrines of Epicurus. Again, Gassendi is working to make Epicurus compatible with a Christian audience to the extent that he can. And so Gassendi is not rigorously arguing the position of Epicurus as does perhaps Cosmo Raimondi, but he is an important source of transmission of Epicurean viewpoint into the English-speaking world.
Let me pick up on something here, which is the last sentence of the first paragraph here in DeWitt under the section we're in now, by the way, which is called the Epicurean Revival. And you've already read it, Cassius, but what it says is this. This combination of Christian with Epicurean doctrine was taken over by Sir Isaac Newton, and by means of it he made acceptable to religious people his revolutionary account of the universe. One of the more interesting claims that comes to us from this period, there was allegedly in classical antiquity this understanding that one of the early sources of atomism was a thinker in Phoenicia, not in Greece, but in Phoenicia, named Mochus, Mochus. And what happened here in the 17th century was that these early figures who were trying to adopt Epicurus's physics and combine it with Christianity, people like Sir Isaac Newton, they pointed to Mochus really as the source of their atomism, and that Democritus and Epicurus were merely transmitters of this earlier doctrine. And the only reason that it mattered to them is because Mochus is from the right area of that eastern shore of the Mediterranean. He's from the right region, in other words, and his name sounds a little bit like Moses. So the claim being made here by people like Isaac Newton and Gassendi and others in the time period, famous names, is that the real source of atomism was the Moses of the Bible. And then it gets transmitted into Greek and survives under the name of Epicurus and Democritus, but the real source was Moses himself. It's a ridiculous claim, but it tells us something about this project, the project of combining certain aspects of Epicureanism with certain aspects of Christianity. The motives here, I think, are quite clear.
Yeah, now that's an example of the kind of thing we're going to close our podcast today with, because as soon as we finish talking about some of this history that DeWitt is laying out, we'll engage in a little evaluation of efforts to revitalize Epicurean viewpoints, and we can discuss the issues that are involved in attempting to combine Christianity with Epicurus. So there's certainly some benefits involved in attempting to do so. Maybe one benefit is you don't get yourself killed or burned at the stake or something like that. But on the other hand, if you lose sight of the fundamental consistency of the whole philosophy, then ultimately you may not be as successful as you would have liked to have been. Among the disciples of Gassendi was the dramatist Molière, who wrote comedies in the style of Menander. And from France, the doctrines of Gassendi were carried to England in the Renaissance period and won a vogue for Epicurean studies, which lasted for about 75 years, roughly from 1650 to 1725. DeWitt says, just as in ancient Rome, however, the threat to morals and religion was eventually recognized, and the adverse reaction set in. As a repressing agent, the grim Puritan was extremely efficient, and the suspected creed was once more driven into anonymity. The atomic theory could be made acceptable by Sir Isaac Newton only upon condition that God was represented as the creator of the atom.
I just wanted to mention, because you read from DeWitt here, that the disciple of Gassendi was the dramatist Molière. And supposedly there is a translation of Lucretius by Molière, which unfortunately is lost. But that was supposed to have existed. So it's not just that Gassendi is interested in this stuff. Molière is writing plays in the style of Menander, a contemporary and friend of Epicurus, and Molière, a translator of Lucretius. So this is quite an exciting time period for Epicureanism, in spite of the fact that, from my opinion, they're doing it wrong. But at least the name is finally resurfacing here in a way that is congenial to people.
Yes, it's hard to judge whether they were right or wrong, or whether they did what they could. And DeWitt now turns to this period where Epicurus has been sort of driven underground again in terms of explicitly endorsing him. But DeWitt says it's no mere accident that John Locke, who during his sojourn in France from 1675 to 1679 became a friend of Francois Bernier, the most outstanding exponent of Gassendi's doctrines, that he should write Essay Concerning Human Understanding and fix upon the sensations as the source of all knowledge. Even though that's not exactly the way Epicurus stated it, it still certainly helps focus attention again on Epicurean theory. And thus, by a sort of irony, Epicurus seems to have furnished a starting point for modern empiricism.
So it's interesting that Locke is part of the story here, because Locke also wrote a different work called A Letter Concerning Toleration, which he published anonymously in Latin and in the Netherlands, in which he's arguing well in advance of social expectation at the time. He's arguing in favor of religious toleration. He says all the faith and power of true religion consists in the inward and full persuasion of the mind, and that faith is not faith without believing. In other words, you cannot force religion on someone. They have to internally value it and believe it for themselves. Otherwise, the proffered salvation has no effect. And so forcing it on people not only does not save their souls, but it also has the sort of opposite effect. It makes people adverse to the very doctrine that you're trying to teach them. So that's interesting. But what's more interesting to me is he goes on to say there that those persons are not at all to be tolerated who deny the being of a God. So even here in John Locke, who's writing, again, anonymously and in Latin, He's not willing to go as far as to say that those who deny immortality of the soul, those people should not be tolerated. And his reason is that you cannot trust, essentially, an atheist to do the right thing, to hold to his promises, to keep contracts and so forth. So even here in John Locke, in the sort of English Renaissance, writing a remarkable work for religious toleration will not make that final case.
Yeah, Joshua, that is a great example of the kind of caution that DeWitt is pointing out and that we need to really bring home here. It's very tempting to be, as a fan or a proponent of Epicurean philosophy, it's very tempting to be enthusiastic about somebody like John Locke or someone who is at least talking about Epicurus, even if they're combining it with Christian doctrine. But there's a serious downside to this compromise and combination of doctrines that your example shows. John Locke's conclusions were not at all consistent there with what Epicurus would have said. And to do justice to DeWitt, we need to repeat here. DeWitt mentions this several times throughout the book. And so let me give a complete statement here of DeWitt's position about Gassendi and John Locke as well, and a serious mistake or deviation they made from Epicurus' own position. DeWitt says, quote, "The mistake of Gassendi to which Locke fell a prey was in confusing the test of knowledge with the source of knowledge. Epicurus based his ethics upon his physics, and as a basis of his physics, he laid down the 12 elementary principles derived chiefly from his predecessors, the truth of which he made no pretense of deriving from sensation." In other words, the deductive nature of his physics and the nature of the atoms and void and how they operate, you don't see atoms and void with your senses. That's a deductive conclusion and not something you can directly see empirically through your senses. Continuing with DeWitt, he says, "Moreover, the test of the truth of all inferential conclusions was not single but triple. The sensations, anticipations, and feelings. The mind of the newborn infant, so far from seeming to Epicurus to be a blank slate, was thought to have dimly inscribed upon it, as the venous system is outlined in the embryo, the patterns of the thoughts of the mature man. Locke's theory of cognition compared to that of Epicurus is naive." So that's an example of, again, you can decide who's right and who's wrong, but there's a clear deviation from Epicurus's position. And you end up endorsing an Aristotelian blank slate position rather than Epicurus's own position, which did not state that the five senses are the only source of knowledge. The information from the five senses is how you interact with the world, but you then process that information from the five senses through the mind and also have impact from the feelings and the anticipations as additional sources of what you conclude to be true. DeWitt then spent some time talking about John Locke's views on limitations as to government and how those match up or don't match up with the teachings of Epicurus, who was rebelling against the teachings of Plato's laws, in which Plato had proposed a maximum of regimentation, and that Locke does, in this case, take up some of the viewpoints of Epicurus in his perspectives. But then DeWitt goes on and says, "In the age of Cromwell and the Restoration in England, it was a pressing problem to decide how much authority a government should possess. It was precisely then that Epicureanism arrived with its doctrine of a minimum of government. Therefore began that momentous series of writings, of which the chief authors were Hobbes, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Jeremy Bentham, and John Stuart Mill. Among the end results were utilitarianism, universalistic hedonism, and 19th century liberalism. This was all anti-Platonic, and behind it was a fertile seed of Epicureanism." It's worth interjecting that Frances Wright dedicates her book, A Few Days in Athens, to Jeremy Bentham. And it's in this group of people and time period that Frances Wright was developing her interest in Epicurus.
Yeah, this is incredibly important. One of the other things that's going on in this time period, he mentioned the Puritan Revolution under Oliver Cromwell. One of the earliest translations of the whole of Lucretius into English actually comes as a result of a very interesting person. It was a Puritan woman named Lucy Hutchinson. She translated Lucretius's poem into English, and in her letter to the Earl of Anglesey explaining why she translated the poem, she says that she wanted to understand what she had heard so much about at second hand. So even while the Puritan government is in full swing and they're destroying icons from Christianity because the Puritans are against that, and even while they're clamping down on the theaters in England, even while they are involved in all of that, Lucy Hutchinson is still translating the poem because people are talking about it. She wants to know what she has heard about it secondhand. She wants to know about what the men in the other room are discussing, and they're discussing this poem. So that's a really interesting story. She also says that if it was still in her hands, she would burn it, and that one of the reasons she translated the poem was because Thomas Creech had translated one book, and they had put his face in a laurel crown on the frontispiece of his book. And she said that she wanted credit. She wanted credit for translating this very difficult poem. And it was, I think, like I said, I think the first translation into English of the whole poem. So this comes out of even the Puritan period here. The image that Stephen Greenblatt uses to describe this is this sort of resurgence of Epicureanism and of classical thinking generally that is welling up, pushing up against an artificial ceiling that had been placed over these ideas, but it cannot ultimately be held back. It seems to be his claim. And this is one example of that. So we are to imagine not just a revival, but a sort of forcible upswelling of the way that the classical Greeks and Romans thought, the way they wrote, the way they painted and sculpted, and also the way they philosophized.
Yeah, even when writers were apologizing for what they were doing, they were investing huge amounts of time and effort in these translations. We could probably go on a separate tangent and spend a whole episode talking about the different translators of Lucretius over the years. You mentioned Creech. Creech is very difficult to read, and I would not recommend anyone try to tackle the Creech edition, even though that was, I think, one of the ones that Thomas Jefferson had. There's a 1743 edition, however, published by Daniel Brown, but we don't know the name of the actual translator, which is significantly better than Creech's edition. But these translators are apologizing for what they're doing and only translating parts of what's there and saying that certain parts of it are too risque to be translated. Under peer pressure, they're not willing to give the full original version, and you have to wonder to what extent their corrections or changes to the text are their true views, or perhaps whether, in fact, it's their apologies which are untrue, and that they really do agree with what they've translated, but they're trying to protect themselves through their apologies. Frances Wright, again, has a section of her book in which she talks about how some of the most important writers who are talking about ethics that are consistent with Epicurus are unwilling to cite the name of Epicurus as their authority.
Right, and now I have to apologize, Cassius, because it was actually John Evelyn, not Thomas Creech, who had only translated the first book, and John Evelyn that Lucy Hutchinson was responding to. So we are now down to the last two paragraphs of the book. You know what I realized, Cassius? We're about to go into Thomas Jefferson. I realized that in our introduction to this episode, where we were talking so much about these historical figures, we never once mentioned Giordano Bruno.
And I know he's one of your favorites, so say something about him so we don't do him a total injustice.
He is one of my favorites. And part of what I love about this whole story is that he was executed. He was burned to death, actually, by the Cardinal Bellarmino in the Campo dei Fiori, what is now the fruit and vegetable market, I think, the Campo dei Fiori in Rome. And in the century afterward, his admirers erected a statue of him, glowering, and he's glowering in the direction of the Vatican. So it's an interesting story, but the reason that he was killed and the reason that he was imprisoned for 7 years before being killed was that he had taken to heart some of Epicurus's and particularly Lucretius's ideas about nature. Particularly, he was fascinated by the idea that the universe really was infinite. He was fascinated by the idea that there were many other worlds or earths or planets like ours. There were many worlds that sustained life. In fact, not just many of them, but an infinite number of them. So he's absolutely fascinated by the atomism and by the grandeur and sort of mystery of the Epicurean cosmos. And for his trouble, he gets imprisoned, as I said, for, I think, 7 years, questioned vigorously. tortured, and never once recants his position. In fact, on the way to the stake, he is being led to his death here. And they ask him if he has any final words. And in that very moment when they're expecting what most people are going to do in that situation, which was beg to get their way out of it, they're expecting essentially a confession. He instead says everything that he believes as clearly as he believes it. And in order to silence him, they drive 2 nails through his lips, one vertically and one horizontally in the shape of a cross to silence him before killing him. So it's one of the most interesting examples of how Epicureanism, and particularly how Lucretius's poem, has survived. Another one we didn't talk about was Montaigne, but I've talked about Montaigne quite a lot. So, we've mentioned maybe, 7 or 8 names today, but it really is a cultural phenomenon of this stuff coming back. And that's part of what's so interesting about the Renaissance here and about later periods.
The treatment of Bruno that you've just mentioned reminds me of the recent discussions we've had about how Philodemus, apparently on anger, takes the position that the Epicurean view is that anger is in fact appropriate in certain situations. And the way that somebody like Bruno was treated produces that kind of a thought process in my own mind at the moment. But okay, we got to Bruno because we began to talk about Thomas Jefferson. We could almost spend another full episode on Thomas Jefferson. And now that I think about it, it's interesting to me. I don't know that I've thought about this before, but DeWitt does not spend a lot of time in his book talking about Thomas Jefferson's views about Epicurus and his writings, where he says to William Short, quote, "I too am an Epicurean." And that letter is something that everyone who's interested at all in American history and Epicurus and how they fit together with Thomas Jefferson, they ought to be aware of and have a copy of the full text of that particular letter, because it is a specific endorsement and application of Epicurus's theories, and shows that Jefferson is encouraging William Short not to be passively idle, because that's contradictory to the instructions of Epicurus to vigorously stand up and pursue life, which is an issue that we regularly talk about. So there's much to be said about Thomas Jefferson's views, which we can only mention here in this part of the episode. But there are collections of excerpts from letters of Jefferson to some of his friends, to John Adams, to William Short, where Epicurus is mentioned or where Epicurean theories are explicitly included. And it would be too much of a tangent to talk about whether Thomas Jefferson was really an Epicurean and all the things that go along with trying to say whether one particular person was consistent with Epicurus or not. But clearly, Thomas Jefferson, as a former president of the United States, is a very well-known figure, and a lot of people think that he was very smart in a lot of different ways. And to have such a person be interested in Epicurus, endorse his views, and even argue them to his friends, even if in private, is a significant endorsement of Epicurus' viewpoint.
It is. And one of the more interesting aspects of this is that Thomas Jefferson, what he was reading and what he was thinking becomes important, because when the Library of Congress burned, Jefferson made the offer to sell his entire collection to Congress near the end of his life, which he did. And so when one of our friends, Don, was at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and came across Jefferson's collection, what he found there were several translations of Lucretius in 3 or 4 different languages. Thomas Jefferson had English editions, he had Latin editions, French editions, German editions, and of course sold to all of them at a very good price to the Congress of the United States for their library.
So there's a lot that has not even been discovered or discussed about Thomas Jefferson's interest in Epicurus. Of course, Thomas Jefferson had a visit from Francis Wright and explicitly endorsed A Few Days in Athens as being an extremely good book that he got much pleasure out of reading.
Just one more example on that front, because Thomas Jefferson's correspondent was William Short, where Thomas Jefferson says, "I too am an Epicurean." We might have to presume then that William Short said, "I am an Epicurean," for Jefferson to give that response. And I bring it up because William Short had spent a lot of time in France, as did, by the way, Frances Wright has some experience in France, where she's traveling in these same circles. And one of the things that William Short experienced in France was jumping into a river to save a drowning boy. Now, there's a story in Francis Wright's book in which a very similar series of events takes place. So this community, of course, we're seeing what they published and what they wrote to each other, what has survived. But I have to imagine that in this circle who's interested in Epicureanism, we've only seen the tip of the iceberg.
I've got to echo that. There's no way that a book like A Few Days in Athens just pops out of the air without a background of discussion and exchange of ideas among both Frances Wright and her friends. I understand her father or her uncle was a philosophy professor during this period. There has got to be a lot of additional material from that period in which Epicurus is discussed by some extremely intelligent people that would be very, very interesting for us to pursue. Okay, let's turn to the final paragraph. And I want to take the liberty of dividing this final paragraph of the book into two sections, because I think the first is extremely important to basically everybody who's interested in Epicurus. The second part of it will be of interest to a lesser number of people, and we'll joke about that when we get to it. But here's the first part of the final paragraph of DeWitt's book. He says, quote, "As for classical scholars, their attitude towards Epicurus has been contemptuous in the main, and their treatment perfunctory. In bibliographies, Epicurus' name runs a poor second to that of his alphabetical neighbor Epictetus. Since 1900, a slow increase of interest has become apparent and still persists, but many tedious investigations remain to be made if the misrepresentations of centuries are to be rectified." Now, I think that would be a great place to end the book, because that's a theme that DeWitt has been hitting throughout and that we've attempted to hit as we've gone through the book, that the commentaries of the classical scholars are for the most hostile. In fact, if you go back to the very beginning, that's where he starts the book, by emphasizing to his reader that they need to understand that Epicurus is at the same time one of the most beloved figures in philosophical history, but also one of the most hated figures. And in most cases, there's no middle ground between those two. And the writers whose works have been preserved over the years are largely those who have hated Epicurus. And again, it's very difficult to find people who are truly neutral on these ideas. The controversy and the implications of Epicurean ideas are so explosive that it's very difficult to detach yourself from the implications of what Epicurus is saying and to treat them neutrally as you're talking about them. So DeWitt is here closing the book with the same kind of caution that he started with, that it's best just to go back to the text of Epicurus himself, as few as they may be and as much as we would like to have more of them. Go back to the original text and you attempt to fairly and objectively and synoptically, from the big picture view, assess what they all mean together. It's very possible to come up with the understanding of Epicurus that Epicurus would likely have wanted people to understand. But if you start with the commentators who are mostly negative and who are wanting to pick and choose what they happen to like about Epicurus, but to dismiss the rest, you'll get a distorted view of Epicurus that, as DeWitt says here, will take many tedious investigations if the misrepresentations are to be rectified.
Right. Now, that's of particular interest to us, isn't it? Because part of our whole project on the forum and here on the podcast and in everything we do is to extend the interest and understanding in Epicurean philosophy. So, like you say, this could be the end of the book. It also represents for us sort of the main project of what we're trying to do here. And to that end, what DeWitt didn't live to see is that a revival in interest in Epicureanism has really taken place, not anywhere on the level of the revival of interest in Stoicism, for example, but you do have a number of groups that are involved in this, and we're just one of them.
Yes, you're right, Joshua. Now, as we move to the latter part of our episode for today, the final section of this paragraph that I mentioned is going to provide us a good bridge to that, because as we close, we're going to talk about some of the obstacles that have been in the way of Epicurean philosophy over the centuries. And here's a bridge to that. DeWitt closes this paragraph by saying this, quote, "In particular, the New Testament must be diligently studied anew for traces of the language and thought of Epicureanism, which in that day was flourishing both in Judea and in the Greek cities where the apostles sought their converts. This background was helping to shape the new doctrine." Now, there's something going on here that DeWitt would choose to close his book on Epicurus with an actually very uninspiring and academic commentary about Christianity. Of course, we've been exposed in this book, and of course, if someone reads DeWitt's St. Paul and Epicurus, they'll get a lot more of it. DeWitt chose to explore parallels between Christianity and Epicurus as a matter of either personal interest for him or an idea, perhaps like the people we've just been mentioning, writers such as Gassendi and so forth, who tried to adapt Epicurus to Christianity to make it more acceptable, or at least to make it more possible for them to talk about it. There's all sorts of motivations that people can have in drawing parallels between philosophies. And we would not be doing justice to DeWitt if we didn't talk about how he's closed the book and his viewpoint on that. I know one thing that came up in some of our recent discussions about it is that despite his pursuit, and correct me if I'm wrong, someone, if you remember this differently, but despite DeWitt's constant pursuit of these parallels between Christianity and Epicurus, I don't recall that DeWitt ever explicitly says about himself, I am a Christian and the Christian views are superior, or the Christian views are correct, or that Epicurus was wrong about something. So it's kind of an interesting thing that DeWitt does not seem to me to be using this book as a bridge to recruit new Christians, as much as he's seemingly using it as a method of having Christians who, as a matter of simple fact, are the majority of people that he was dealing with in his time, and frankly, that we continue to deal with today. That fact that they are Christians does provide a common reference point to introduce a new subject to people.
Right. Now, there's an obituary of DeWitt by H. Bennett, written in a journal called Phoenix, Volume 12, Number 4, published in the winter of 1958 by the Classical Association of Canada. And I'm just going to quote a small part of it here. It was natural, says H. Bennett, that DeWitt's blithe spirit should turn in later years to the study of Epicurean philosophy, many precepts of which he found to accord with his own views of life. The works of his early retirement, Epicurus and His Philosophy and St. Paul and Epicurus, are a defense of the philosopher against the imputation of a vulgar hedonism and a demonstration that Epicurean doctrines have much in common with the Christian theology of St. Paul. So the same kind of claim being made here, but if this eulogizer is to be believed, then it's true in a sense that DeWitt had incorporated some sense of Epicurean philosophy into his own life. That's directly what the obituary says, many precepts of which he found to accord with his own views of life.
You know, interesting there, as far as the reference to Paul goes, yeah, the views of Paul that he found to be consistent with those of Epicurus were things like charity and hope and interrelationships between friends and so forth, things that are absolutely unrelated to the real core of the issue in terms of whether there's a divine God creating and running the universe and whether there's life after death. I don't think there's many Christians who would fail to understand that those doctrines of Epicurus are totally incompatible with Christianity. And so you have to wonder whether the person who wrote that obituary was, again, just being nice and pointing out that, yes, there's a lot that our poor departed friend had good to say about the doctrines of St. Paul and how they were similar to those of Epicurus. And he just decides to leave out the fact that the most penetrating and controversial of Epicurean positions have absolutely nothing to do with the positions of St. Paul and just are totally contradictory to them. So with that discussion of DeWitt personally, and maybe the obstacles or issues that DeWitt personally faced, we can close the episode today with a general reflection on how those same issues have been at work throughout the centuries and how they continue to be important to us today. Taking an Epicurean position in the middle of an extremely religious environment can lead to your losing your job or your friends or your family or your life even, as Giordano Bruno, whether he was explicitly Epicurean or not, found out. And many, many others who have been more free-thinking and willing to break away from the doctrines of Orthodox Christianity have found out. Of course, in the ancient world, there was a specific closing of the organized schools at different times in different places. But maybe the issue that is going to continue to be the most interest to the most people would be the position that Epicurus' argument about freedom from fear of death and freedom from fear of the gods is intended to bring comfort and to address the anxiety that people have about these issues. But there are people out there who take the position that their beliefs about there being a divine God who's providentially creating and guiding the world and that he's going to provide for life after death and so forth, They see those views as some of the greatest sources of comfort in their lives. And rather than being a source of distress, they're the most important things to them. So you've got people who take just totally divergent positions about what does bring them comfort and what brings them pain. And combined with that is the question of, well, do we always choose comfort or do we choose pain, as Epicurus says, when the choice of an action that brings short-term pain ends up leading to greater pleasure or lesser pain over time? You have this conflict and tension between those people who are interested in pursuing what they believe is the truth, and which of those positions Epicurus was really of himself. Did he set out in his philosophy to pursue the direction it led him because he had already made up his mind that pleasure was the goal of life? Or did, in fact, he set out, according to the tradition, that he was rejecting the position that his teachers gave him about chaos being at the origin of the universe? And in rejecting that, he wanted to know the truth about how the universe originated, which then led him over time to his conclusions about the nature of pleasure and pain and happiness and so forth. So there's many, many issues involved. And so I'll throw it open from here for us to discuss through the end of the episode what people think about those questions and how we'd like to leave those thoughts as we end our discussion of the book Epicurus and His Philosophy.
I could take up the question, Cassius, by pointing to Thomas More's Utopia, which was a book written after reading a travelogue by Amerigo Vespucci. Vespucci had made a comment that the mode of life of the Native Americans was Epicurean because they didn't have churches that they went to and so forth. They didn't have governments that bound them to certain duties and so forth. So Thomas More takes up the challenge of writing an extensive work on religious toleration called Utopia. And the word utopia, by the way, means no place. This will never happen to Thomas More. This can't exist anywhere. It's unsustainable. But he takes this new world that is being discovered at the time and chooses that to situate his utopia as a place that is far removed from European culture and religion and mores. And what you find in Utopia is a toleration of a type of approach to life that is so foreign to the approach of the very, very Christian England of More's own day, to the point where the king of Utopia says that any religion, any belief in God can be tolerated. We're not going to police heresy. We're not going to police orthodoxy. You can believe whatever you want, with one exception. The only thing that cannot be tolerated is the belief that the soul dies with the body and that the universe is the mere sport of chance. In other words, that it wasn't created and doesn't operate by divine providence. To believe those two things was to put yourself beyond the pale, even in this place that in fiction is far in advance in toleration compared to the Europe and to the England of More's day, that even in this imaginary world, those two beliefs are not to be tolerated. In other respects, his utopia is designed in such a way that it resembles certain aspects of Epicureanism, and his impetus for writing the book was Epicureanism. But what he does in this book is systematically draws up what he thinks an Epicurean society might look like. But then he rips the heart out of it by saying that, oh, no. These two things you cannot believe. You cannot believe that the soul dies with the body. And you cannot believe that the universe is the mere sport of chance. Well, to have Epicureanism, but not those ideas, to attempt to be an Epicurean and believe that the soul is immortal and that there is life after death, or to attempt to be Epicurean and think that we do live in a specially created universe that has us in mind, is a contradiction in terms, because those two ideas are fundamentally non-Epicurean. And I think that that is part of the problem. It's the problem with Gassendi and his project. It's the problem with Isaac Newton and his attempt to connect atomism back to Moses. And it's certainly a problem here in Thomas More's Utopia. And so the question then is, how do we get away from that problem? How do we get to a point where people can take on board the ethics of Epicurus? Ethics where, like you said, Cassius, compassion and kindliness and charity are valued, and where life is valued because it brings pleasure. How do we take those ideas on board? And some of his understanding of nature, which the scientists of the day were beginning to confirm in a way, how do we take that on board without taking the main belief on board, which is fundamentally the belief that the soul is mortal and dies when the body dies? And for an Epicurean, you can't really divorce those two.
Okay, we're going to end up running out of time for this episode today. So let's go ahead and go around the table and see if there are other closing thoughts or comments that we want to include before we do bring it to a conclusion. Martin, any thoughts today?
Yes. We let the book finish at page 358, but after that comes still the section on bibliography, which is an interesting read, and especially the last sentence I will quote, because it pretty much says in different words what Cassis, you said already earlier. As things are, however, the student will benefit more by resolute study of the text of Epicurus himself than by excursions into the bewildering auxiliary literature, still bedeviled by a hostile tradition. It is the aim of the present study to have pioneered in this direction.
Martin, I'm so glad you pointed that out, because you're exactly right. The bibliography section is only 2 pages long, but that closing statement, it is almost a more fitting end to the entire book than the official end on page 358. I got to echo what he said. You'll benefit more from the resolute study of the text of Epicurus himself than by excursions into the bewildering auxiliary literature still bedeviled by a hostile tradition. And in this last sentence, I see that's what DeWitt wanted this book to be accepted as and what he was trying to do. Quote, it is the aim of the present study to have pioneered in this direction. And I think that's the way you end up taking DeWitt, for all of his flaws, for all of his excursions into parallels that some of us accept and some of us don't. What DeWitt has done in this book is to pioneer in the direction of going back to the original text, interpreting them in ways that are more consistent with not only the full body of the text, but also with fewer emendations. That's something we've been running across in recent months as several of our core participants at Epicurean Friends. I specifically have to mention Don, as they have gotten into the attempt to understand and read Greek for themselves and looked back at the texts that are available on the internet to look at the original versions of them and see how even Usner, Bailey, just about everybody, it seems like, is tempted to amend and make changes or interpret the text in ways that are consistent with their viewpoint, but not always consistent with what is actually on the piece of paper that has been preserved over the centuries. And so what DeWitt has done in numbers of places that he's talked about is to go back and look past these emendations that the authorities have come up with to the original text, and found that they mean something different than what Bailey or Usner or others tells us they mean. And that's something that it takes a lot of work to be able to dig out and to do, but it's very valuable, very rewarding. I want to, again, appreciate the work that Don has done in this direction, because he's showing us examples of how you cannot just simply trust a commentator. You need to go back as best you can and validate what's being said in the original text. So, Martin, that's a great comment to end the podcast with here today. Calasini, anything?
Yes, since this is the concluding episode and looking back over the whole experience, since we've pretty much gone through DeWitt with a fine-tooth comb, are there any things that pop out to any of you regarding cautions a newer student, maybe someone who does not have any background study in Epicurus? Are there any cautions that you would give?
Joshua, let me take that first and say this. The most important caution that people need to take, Calasini, would arise from what we've been discussing here at the end about these writers in the past who have attempted to compromise and combine Christianity or other viewpoints with Epicurean philosophy, or those who have taken one part of the teachings of Epicurus and attempted to focus only on that without the rest. That's the main caution that people need to take, not only with DeWitt, but with anyone. I think DeWitt is probably less culpable of this than most other writers. But just like we criticize DeWitt at times for being tempted to appeal to people through their Christianity to get interested in Epicurus, there's also a strong temptation to attempt to appeal to people to get interested in Epicurus purely on the grounds that people want to be happy. And I think there's a similar problem with both approaches. If you focus only on the parallels to Christianity, or if you focus only on the final conclusion of ethics about pleasure being the goal or happiness being the goal, then you don't get the full picture that is necessary in order to understand exactly how Epicurus is approaching these problems. DeWitt's presentation of Epicurean philosophy is going to appeal to somebody who's got some knowledge of Epicurus, some degree of perhaps interest in philosophy or higher level training to start with. It doesn't require a lot of higher level training, but it certainly is a lot of technical information that is going to appeal to some people and not to others. So it can be useful to appeal to somebody who's interested in parallels with Christianity as an opening position. Or it can be useful to appeal to people who are just anxious or unhappy and they want to deal with their unhappiness. But it's a very subtle and complicated thing to appeal to those people in a way that conveys the whole truth of the situation to them. It seems to me the sooner you are able to introduce the full aspects of the philosophy to those people, the better off you're going to be, the less time you're going to waste for yourself or for them. If people are committed to some doctrine that is incompatible with a significant part of Epicurus, then the benefit that they're going to get from spending a lot of time and reading his views on happiness is going to be much curtailed than if they're willing to openly address the full aspect of the philosophy. So I cut myself off there by saying that that's the main caution I think that needs to be adopted. Just like DeWitt starts his book with the caution that people need to understand that Epicurus was the most beloved and also the most hated of philosophers. People need to understand and be cautious about why they're approaching Epicurus and what they expect to find. And as soon as they can, they need to open themselves up to the wider picture so as soon as possible get an idea of where it's all going. Joshua, what are your thoughts on it?
Well, since we're giving Don kudos today, and I think that's very justified, I can cite page 4 of his Letter to Menoikeus, a new translation with commentary, when he himself quotes Philodemus. Don writes, Philodemus himself is on record as advocating that Epicureans needed to study the works of Epicurus to really understand the philosophy. And Philodemus says, he who claims to know us and to be instructed by us, who claims to be a genuine reader of various writings and of complete books, even if he says something correctly, he has only memorized various quotations and does not know the multitude of our thoughts. What he has to do, he looks up in summaries, like people who believe that they can learn to be steersmen from books and can cross every ocean. And Don quotes another one in Philodemus. But the most shocking thing of most Epicureans is the unforgivable inactivity in regards to the books. Now, my intention at the end of this episode is not to come off quite as sternly as Philodemus does there, but that's the main caution, I would say, is that as far as secondary literature goes, DeWitt is notable for a number of reasons, one of which is that this is sort of the fullest positive or almost pro-Epicurean explication of Epicurean philosophy that touches on almost all of the major aspects of the philosophy. Not just the ethics, not just the physics, not just the canon of what's true or of how we know what's true, but all of it and how it all comes together. And so the book is very useful in that respect, and I've actually probably learned a lot just by going through it in this series, but it cannot be regarded as a substitute for spending time with the surviving works of Epicurus, the surviving poem of Lucretius, for example. So that part is always to be kept in mind, that we have to return to the books, as Philodemus is urging us to do.
The other thing we should always do is think of what makes the most sense for us. And when I do this, I check precedent in the text. It's almost always that it matches what Epicurus wrote, but if we use our, in itself, consistent interpretation. And if someone finds out it doesn't make sense for that person, then that person is better off with a different philosophy.
Great point, Martin. Not everybody is cut out to be an Epicurean. Not everybody is going to agree with Epicurus. Just bringing the facts and communicating clearly to someone is no guarantee that the person is going to agree with you. You have to be prepared for that. And that's a big problem, Martin, that you brought up, because people do tend to think, well, everybody wants to be happy. Epicurus is all about being happy. Why isn't everybody just a big fan of Epicurus? All we need to do is tell everybody what he had to say, and everybody will be happy with each other and happy with Epicurus, and we'll all be friends and everything will be nice. And that's just not the way it is, because people who are committed to opposing viewpoints are not going to take kindly to what Epicurus has to say. Even if you can get past someone who's a Stoic and who is suspicious of pleasure and happiness, even if you get past that type of person who objects to happiness, which thankfully does not exist in so great in numbers, once you get into the fundamentals of Epicurean philosophy, there's a much larger number of people who are just not going to agree with what his position was. And as intelligent or as articulate as you might be, you're not going to be able to persuade them. Again, that's something that Frances Wright brings up in her book, that arguments from people of opposing positions rarely is able to bring people to the same conclusion if they've started out committed to positions that are not reconcilable. We're going to begin to run long, so let me close the episode by saying one more thing about what Callicini had to say. Epicurean philosophy is not tremendously difficult in its outlines. Cicero says it's the simplest of the major philosophies to consider, but it has very subtle aspects to it that do take a background in reading. And what we're going to be addressing in Cicero are a large number of the strongest arguments that the great minds of the ancient world put together to oppose Epicurean philosophy and to oppose what Epicurus was teaching. And unless you have some kind of a background in their arguments and in Epicurean philosophy as well, you're going to find those arguments of Cicero to be very difficult to deal with. And people are going to be tempted to just put the book down, put the arguments away, and say, I don't care what Cicero or anybody else thinks, this is what I think. But if you're going to have confidence in your philosophy, you need to understand the arguments against your philosophy. And after all the work we've done in this podcast over the past 180 some episodes, I think we've gotten, among those who have been following along with us, a much deeper understanding of Epicurean philosophy than we had at the beginning. And we are now much more equipped to dive into Cicero's objections to Epicurus and his ridicule of Epicurus. And we're going to be able to deal with them from a much greater position of strength and understanding of Epicurus's position than we could have done in the past. So hopefully, as we tackle a new project, we're going to enter a new phase of being able to explain Epicurean positions to other people, so that they can also profit from it and, along with their friends, live better and happier lives. So with that, let's close the episode. Drop by the forum. Let us know what you're thinking about what we've said in this podcast and participate with us there. So until next week, bye.